The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. RSA offers business-driven security solutions that provide organizations with a unified approach to managing digital risk that hinges on integrated visibility, automated insights, and coordinated actions. RSA solutions are designed to effectively detect and respond to advanced attacks, manage user access control, and reduce business risk, fraud, and cybercrime. RSA protects millions of users around the world and helps more than 90% of the Fortune 500 companies thrive and continuously adapt to transformational change. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/RSA security.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, along with Scott Lyons, Josh Morpett, and Matt Alderman. One quick announcement before we jump into some security and compliance news. Our next webcast is February 13th with Sri Sundaralingam, Vice President, Product and Solutions Marketing at ExtraHop, where they will be discussing cloud-native network detection and response. You can register for our upcoming webcast by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast drop-down from the top of the menu bar, and clicking on registration. Okay, guys, we haven't done news in a while. Anything newsworthy that crossed your screens this week? We have a couple stories up on our wiki.
Just a
Anything
few.
jump out to anyone?
Well, I see this breaking news coming across on CCPA, modifications in the CCPA law in California. And so I started I'm digging into it, trying to figure out, okay, so what changed, right? You see these breaking modifications. So I'm in the document with all the red lines in it, and it looks like they're adding some scope to CCPA. They added a definition for employee benefits, employee-related information. So
Are they adding scope, or are they
these are brand new
defining scope?
They're brand new definitions, and so my guess is if they're defining what employment benefits and employment-related information is, that they are also further down in this document getting called. So I think there is some expansion of scope here beyond just consumer data to potentially employment data. It kind of hard. It's the thing's just full of red lines.
You know AB5. Have you heard of AB5, Matt?
No.
So AB5 is the new California legislation that basically outlaws, and I'm probably bastardizing this, outlaws independent contractors. So if you have independent contractors working for you, like Uber has all independent contractors, all the gig economy basically is what they're trying to outlaw.
Yeah.
But it also things like nannies and a lawn. I hire a kid to mow my lawn. Now I have to give him a W-2.
Yeah, but look, Uber and all these guys are pushing back. This is going to go to court. It's going to go. It's going to get. Yeah, there's going to be all kinds of interesting cases around that one. But it's just interesting that I see new definitions in here, which tells me that they're looking to modify scope for CCPA. But
so what I'm wondering is if there's sort of like all these different laws, AB5 and CCPA and everything are going to sort of heterodyne off each other and really create a new sort of milieu and a new environment, at least in California, if not in other parts of the country, just by the fact that even though each one has a little bit of information that changes scope, changes definition, but when you start talking about employment data and in another law, the definition of employee changes, that gets interesting.
Yeah, I see some interesting mobile device. If you collect information from consumers' mobile device, you have to notify them as well. You have to have a notice in the app on the mobile device. That's a whole new section in here. There's just some interesting mods in this regulation, which I think is going to definitely expand the scope of CCPA based on what I'm seeing in the red lines.
So it's interesting, full disclosure, the person that we were going to interview today that had to cancel at the last minute because of a conflict was going to discuss CCPA. So we're going to hope to reschedule them because I don't think we've focused an episode yet on CCPA, and we probably should do that in the near future. Yep. It was interesting that you found an article that was talking about how it's continuing to be redlined, CCPA. I found an article where a merchant that recently discovered that they had been breached has filed a lawsuit against Salesforce and has actually cited CCPA in the context of the lawsuit. So it's not even necessarily set in stone yet. And case law is at least in the beginning stages of being executed, if that's the right term, to see how CCPA plays out and what are the consequences under CCPA.
Yes, agreed. Case law will decide a lot of this at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it always does.
Yeah, we've seen that GDPR, CCPA, all of these new consumer data privacy laws there's a few sort of fundamental pieces that case law is going to be very, very interesting on. The New York State amended breach notification law. All of these laws have something in common. If you have the data of one of our people, GDPR Europeans, CCPA Californians, New York State amended blah, 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 New Yorkers, if you have the data of one of our people in your database, you're under our law, even if you're in Wisconsin, which is not in Europe, California, or New York, okay? And you're under our law and don't care, done. We're going to fine you. You're under our regulation. I mean, isn't that like a jurisdictional issue or a venue issue? But all of them have this, and it's going to be really fascinating to see how this plays out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Agreed.
All right. We will see how it all pans out eventually. And speaking of pan,
that's a horrible.
See what I did there?
Segue.
Wow. Found an article. It's my article number 2. It's entitled "Back to the Basics: What is the Cost of Non-PCI Compliance?" And basically, the gist of this article is sort of touching on a lot of the things that we've been discussing the last couple of weeks in terms of what is the cost. There's the fines that are involved, but there's the cost of investing in equipment and technologies to get yourself to a point of compliance. What was the other one that they mentioned? They had it all in bullet form. They even cited increased costs of insurance, which I thought was interesting. So basically the gist of the article was, with all the other things that are coming down the pike, like GDPR and CCPA, don't forget PCI, because it's going to cost you a lot of money if you're not PCI compliant. And it'll be even worse if you compound that with GDPR and CCPA.
I'm sorry, I'm going to push back. This article is crud.
Sure.
This article is absolute crud. I can say other words, but I won't.
We'll leave it at crud, but go ahead. This is not necessarily a news article; it's a blog. But please enlighten us.
So fines, recurring charges, absolutely agreed. Increased cost of insurance and claims. Yeah, BS. Maybe. We just talked about that. That's crap. Not gonna. Right. That doesn't happen that way. The only way that would happen is if it's so public that the insurance company's like, look, just because you're so public, you're more of a target. You're just visible. That would be the only way your insurance would go up. And even then, it'll go down after a year or two. CCPA, valid, good point. Potential lawsuits from consumers. All right. Our own research also shows that consumers will stop spending with organizations should they suffer a data breach for like 6 months. I don't know what research they did, but I'm going to say that I doubt it's any good.
How many people are still using Facebook after all the issues with privacy in Facebook? Numbers still grow, revenue's still growing. Did it really have that big of an impact? I mean, for us, for people like me that didn't even have an account or was really worried about it, some have, but people are still using the platform.
So what I'm going to say is, author of this article, who is Stacy Richards, I think it says.
Let's call the people out. Yes, go ahead.
Please. I'd like to invite you onto the show and we'll talk.
Well, where I thought the article was crud was, they're basically saying, you should be doing PCI because you're going to get fined there. And they were tying PCI data to privacy data, PII data, which also makes you subject to other things like GDPR, CCPA. And the conclusion was the answer is to descope from PCI DSS, which basically says punt it to a third party.
Which
and that's
is one
where
of Jeff's big pet peeves.
Huge pet peeve. And to make it clear, you can push the responsibility for compliance onto a third party, but that does not mean in any way, shape, or form that you've pushed liability onto the third party.
That is correct. So this is
buyer beware.
Yep, we've seen this before, right? We talked Ramlich-Bliley in the previous segment. Third-party risk, they outsource a bunch of stuff. The regulator said you can outsource a function, you can't outsource a risk, you're still liable. Same thing exists in PCI. So
I'm going to throw a news story just about this, and I'll find the news story. But Wyndham Hotels, everybody knows that a franchisee, a franchise Wyndham Hotel got breached, leading to some data being lost, and the parent company was found to have some liability, not 100% liability, but was found in court to have liability. And this came about. I was just at that franchise show I told you about a minute ago. Or in last segment, I'm sorry. And they were all freaking out. They're like, wait, but these are totally separate business entities. I'm like, there's a link.
Yeah.
You can take that franchise agreement can take some of that responsibility away, but it doesn't necessarily take the liability away. I'm sorry.
Right.
There are requirements as a parent company to ensure the security and safety of the consumer data.
Yeah. So that article, Jeff, was a good job trying to overlap credit card with privacy data. NIST releases the new privacy framework. So it's out there for everybody. Digging into this, because I wanted to understand what's included in here. So they break this down, and just like in the NIST cybersecurity framework, they break down these different domains to cover, right? They do the same thing with the privacy framework. I thought it was interesting. Identify, right? You have to do inventory around the data. Govern. Build your governance policies, your risk management strategy, back to risk management, awareness training. You have control. Data processing is really where the controls come in. It's all on the data side. Then communicate and protect. So an interesting framework. Haven't dug into all the details yet, but they've set up a framework very similar to the NIST cybersecurity framework of these are the different domains you have to look at when you're looking at privacy of data.
Yeah, I need like a cross-country flight to San Francisco to give me time to read the new NIST privacy framework.
Yeah, I can't remember how many pages this thing is.
You'll get one here very shortly, right? You can see us at RSA, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of details in here. Appendix A is really where the meat is in this document for all those listeners who want to go find it. It's pages and pages of the domains and then the different categories and subcategories embedded in here. There's a lot of data.
But I respect NIST for being very thorough and providing comprehensive coverage on whatever it is that they tackle, be it the 800 series or any of the various frameworks that they put out. And I'm a little bit chagrined as I was reading the article and they mentioned the risk cybersecurity framework. That's already going on 6 years old. Yep. Where's the time flown?
Yeah.
But given all that we were saying in the first segment about companies not caring, how do you get the companies to care? How do you motivate them? Where does any of the NIST frameworks fit into? If companies aren't motivated, if companies aren't don't have the right attitude about security, let's say, how do any of the NIST frameworks fit in? If you're a non-government contractor, non-government firm, organization, NIST is a voluntary thing. Right. NIST is just one of many frameworks that are out there. I don't know that NIST is successfully, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. I don't know that NIST has successfully tackled the sort of the public image or public perception of where somebody you should look at and how does NIST get people to take things seriously or pay attention?
Yeah, but it's not in the mission of NIST to be a public facing entity. NIST is, and you can tell me I'm wrong here, NIST is for government, period.
It is,
right?
But they've built frameworks that people can use as a guideline. And what's missing is the teeth to say, look, some of these regulations, if you're not adopting these frameworks, then you are potentially liable. That's one way to do it. Josh, you were talking the last time on the why, right? For organizations that really want to do the right thing, these are great reference guides to give them a roadmap of how to do it. But Jeff, to your point, I think what NIST does with the frameworks is a great outline. It's the implementation in helping people implement or providing regulations that if you don't implement, there's ramifications. That's what's missing with some of these frameworks. Unfortunately.
And ironically, PCI actually does reference NIST in the context of when it talks about using strong cryptography for the transmission or storage of credit card data. It actually cites NIST as a reference organization for getting a definition or parameters or what is currently considered strong cryptography. Of course, that's why we have the debacle the last couple years of the whole SSL TLS thing, where NIST says, this is bad, it's deprecated, and yet I know I had arguments with certain people at Tenable over whether it was really a big deal or not, because it was a cryptographic type of flaw that requires a lot of calculation and a lot of sort of conditions to exist and huge amounts of data to actually be able to execute any kind of a cryptographic attack. And my point...
That goes back to what Scott was saying. When NIST is government-based, they're thinking of nation-state threat analysis and profiles, whereas, in the AI world, we're really not thinking about nation-state as often as maybe they are.
But even then, let me finish that thought and I'll let you pick up, Matt. But, when I was at Tenable and arguing that, when PCI first came out and said you've got to deprecate all use of SSL, early TLS, because NIST says so, the initial plugins that were written for Nessus were written in the context of PCI. And my point was, but we also have government customers. Shouldn't we be telling our government customers that they shouldn't be using this? Because that's what NIST says. And this was happening in like 2014, 15-ish range, where the notice that had gone out from NIST about these things being deprecated were already months, if not years old. I don't know if I ever won or lost that argument, but I'm not at Tenable anymore, so that should tell you something.
I think you lost that one. But a valid point. Again, it's the implementation. What I'd like to see out of NIST cybersecurity framework and maybe the NIST privacy framework is these become baselines for any safe harbor type of legislation, right? Maybe you see a safe harbor for privacy at some point where you're saying, look, if you've implemented the NIST cybersecurity privacy framework and you can prove that these different things are in control, therefore you limit liability in a GDPR or CCPA example, right? Again, there has to be an incentive there. Safe harbor potentially is an incentive to lower liability. That's how I think these things would get adopted and potentially used a lot more, versus people who want to do the right thing and need a guide. That it's great, it's there, but the incentive on a broader scale just doesn't exist for these two frameworks, unfortunately.
Right. So, Scott, you had posted a story. I guess we could spend a few minutes talking about the indictments that were put down, was it 2 days ago, against Equifax?
Yeah, the Fed finally named 4 members of Chinese factions that went after Equifax. And it was actually really interesting because there was an excerpt, as I tried to dig to it, there was an excerpt that was taken out of the Equifax
movie Blade Runner.
Sorry. Yeah, Equifax being taken to court that really caught my attention. And the blurb that was taken out of it was and I quote directly from the suing of Equifax, right? The documents that get released. It says defendants' reliance on an automated vulnerability scanner without any other compensating controls to ensure that the vulnerability had been fully addressed further contributed to the failure to patch the vulnerability. Although many companies use automated vulnerability scanners, the defendant did not maintain an accurate inventory of the public-facing technology assets running Apache struts, and therefore did not know where the scanner needed to run. Also, they relied on a scanner that was not configured to search through all potentially vulnerable facing websites, right? So it's not so much that Equifax was taken to court, right? But it was a mix of a couple of different things. So we had a nation state coming after Equifax, right? Equifax holds a lot of data about a lot of people and can be the big wrecking ball in the room for a lot of lives. But it was also the fact that Equifax didn't know where their data was, right? They didn't have a comprehensive solution to say all servers that are public facing need to be vulnerability scanned, right? And therefore the scanner wasn't tuned correctly. So the real question of liability is it on Equifax or is it on the scanner, right? And then are we throwing in a nation state attack just to throw it in, right? We know that nation states are going to be doing these things. They've been playing these games since, oh dear God, the beginning of time. But who's really at fault here?
They're actually a little bit of both, right? There's a whole identify component, right? Having accurate inventory and making sure you're detecting and scanning the right stuff. But then part of it is, well, is it the fault of the vulnerability scanner because it didn't have the checks in it, or the person who configured it that didn't configure it correctly to actually do those checks, right? So it gets a little interesting, but it points out a couple of those core domains that we talk a lot about is basics, right? I have to know what's on my network. I have to know what's there. I have to be able to look for vulnerabilities across. If you don't have an accurate inventory list and you're missing a whole bunch of public websites that have this vulnerability that open up a breach, they just opened up a very interesting can of worms for organizations that really don't know what's on their network and what they're doing.
I don't know what our schedule looks like in terms of the next time we'll have a chance to discuss amongst ourselves, but I would love to do a segment that just talks about this whole notion of vulnerability segment and when and how do you implement a vulnerability scanner. We touched on it a little bit. I happened to sit in on Enterprise Security Weekly last week, and it came up a little bit, did a little bit of the research for the context of that discussion. But I think there's a huge disconnect between what I learned last week. SANS teaches vulnerability management starts with a vulnerability scan, and my exposure to PCI, which has vulnerability management being mostly two different requirements 5 and 6, and the vulnerability scanning comes much later in requirement 11. More on that later. That'll have to serve as a little bit of teaser. I'm afraid our time is pretty much up for the day. If you want to see these stories, refer to our wiki.securityweekly.com. This is Security and Compliance Weekly, episode 17. Gentlemen, I've enjoyed the conversation today.
Great.
Let's do it again next week.
Yep.
For now, this is Security and Compliance Weekly. Build bridges, and let's close the gap between security and compliance.